play ball. Will Rhode Island's crumbling economy and the soon-to-be-passed 2021 state budget cause even more families and businesses to flee our state? That's the big question this summer. Welcome to In the Dugout. I'm your host, Mike Stenhouse. And in just a few moments, we'll be talking with URI economics professor Len Lardaro, and we'll discuss his state economic outlook index. But In the Dugout, as you know, is just a casual interview forum where it's reminiscent of my days as a pro ball player, where we'd sit in the dugout and we would talk about life and whatever else we felt like it. So it's very, very informal, and it's our new video series from our center, and I hope you enjoy today. You know, by any measure, the state's economic outlook is not good. Just take a look at these headlines. We all know these economic headlines. We all know that our state has been doing pretty well outside of the tragedies and the inexplicable deaths at our nursing homes. You know, we've done pretty well other than that with the pandemic, medically speaking. But has there been a massive economic price today to pay, I should say, more so than in other states? Did Governor Raimondo overreact unilaterally and with no check or balance from what I would call a cowardly and absent General Assembly? Did she impose severe and inconsistent restrictions that are providing an imbalance in our economy? The headlines were stunning. You know, even before the China virus crisis came, employers, investors, and people were fleeing our state. And as we discussed last week with House Republican leader Blake Filippi, we anticipate there's going to be massive tax increases or massive debt imposed with this upcoming budget. What is that going to do to our economy? Is that going to cause even more people to leave our state, even more long-term economic harm, and make Rhode Island even a less hospitable place to raise a family or to build a career? In other words, will Rhode Island become even a place Americans will be less likely to call home? So let's welcome in Len Lardaro, professor of economics at the University of Rhode Island. Earlier this week, Professor Lardaro published his most recent economic outlook, the Lardaro. Why can't I say your name? Lardaro, it's a tongue twister for me.
You did well, you got it.
Yeah, which does not have good news for our state. Professor, welcome to our show.
Thanks for having me here.
All right, so you know we got a tradition. We're in the dugout, so we got to look the part a little bit. So in honor of you, I've got my URI hat on. What do you got for me?
I got my other alma mater, Indiana University.
Your other alma mater, explain.
I went to URI undergraduate, and then that's how I learned about Rhode Island. Then graduate school was Indiana University. Yeah.
Wow, so if the Hoosiers were to play the Rams in hoops, who would you cheer for?
I don't know. I think I'd take a night off. I don't know.
That never happened.
Yeah, I don't know. Hopefully someday, but who knows?
Well, good to see you. Thanks for playing along with us today. All right, so your economic outlook factor came out, and of course, as with all states, the economy is down. The outlook is terrible. You say in your recent post that Rhode Island may have gone past absolute bottom. First of all, give us an overview of your index, and let's bring up the last numbers as you do that, and then tell us what the last month said.
Yeah, the index itself, the current conditions index, is a broadly based set of indicators that really characterize how well Rhode Island is doing at any point in time. It has 12 indicators, and what you have, a neutral score of 50 means that 6 of the 12 improve, so we're not going up or down. Above 50 means we're improving and expanding. Below 50 means we're contracting. And there are some leading indicators in there, so it does have a little bit of a tendency to lead, especially for downturns or whatever. So what I've been finding, and this pandemic is really, I know it's being characterized as a recession, but we've never seen anything like this. The best description I've seen anywhere is a medically induced coma. I mean, literally, the rug was pulled out from under the whole economy. There was virtually nothing functioning except for government, some parts of retailing, whatever. And so the numbers we got I've never seen anything like it. And for the last 3 months, when I get the data done, it takes me days to figure out even what to write. It's so horrible. I mean,
You know,
I've never seen things like it. In 1 month, initial or new claims for unemployment insurance, which is a really good measure of layoffs, went up 1,600% compared to the prior year.
unthinkable stuff, isn't it? It
I know
really
it's
is.
down to only 600% now compared to a year earlier. So what I did this time for the May release, and I've never done this in over 20 years, because the year over year stuff is so horrible, I figured, well, we're moving a little bit better on a monthly basis. So I added a table for what the monthly changes were, and at least that was a neutral value. But a lot of that might be revised. So, we're suffering here. We really are. But one thing I would disagree with you on, like you said before, Rhode Island really wasn't doing that well before the pandemic hit. And I can, and I've looked at that. I mean, our growth rate as a
Oh,
state.
if I
real
said that, I
GDP
didn't mean to say that. I
Okay.
meant to say that even before the pandemic hit, people were leaving the state because of poor economic conditions.
Okay. Yeah. Because we had like a 0% growth rate in
Right,
2016,
right.
0.8 after that, 0.6. And, we've been really not doing well. So, and I had predicted that probably about a 75% chance that we would have hit a recession by the end of 2020,
Anyway,
even had the pandemic not hit.
so first of all, back to what you said earlier, you talk about a description, some people are calling this a depression. It certainly is depression era statistics, but I call it a suppression. A depression, as you know, and I know as an economics major, is an economic induced, downturn, but this was a government induced suppression. So I call this an economic suppression, which
Yeah.
I think is a
The
good
point is,
word,
it's
right?
not cyclical, and that's the
That's right.
important. I've been trying to, get my arms around that in writing. Is this is not cyclical? It's just one of those anomalous events. The numbers are just bizarre. They will get better, but the issue, and it's always the same thing for us: how much better, how quickly, and
So
are
do
we
do
set
you
up for
really think
success?
we've hit absolute bottom in Rhode Island? Are we on the upslope? Well, we'll talk about how fast later, but are we on the upslope?
Well, a little bit, but I mean, let me clarify this. Absolute bottom is when the economy was literally shut down.
Okay.
And so to go below the absolute bottom, you'd have to go negative. You know what I mean? So the point is that we're not at shut down. We are improving, not necessarily rapidly. And there are some real quirks in the numbers. And you've heard the ones with the unemployment rate nationally and things. We have some of that. So we're moving forward, thank God. But you can't do any worse than shut down. And so the real things going forward, I hope we don't have a second wave or people from other states really hurt us. But there are going to be nationally a lot of things that are real headwinds for us, like all the bankruptcies coming,
Yeah.
the expirations of unemployment insurance at the end of July.
Yeah.
There's just a host of things that worry me.
So we know every state is suffering to some degree with this. Rhode Island, with the headlines we put up earlier, Rhode Island seems to always not only be the first in and last out of a recession or suppression or whatever, but we also seem to be the hardest hit, as those headlines said. Does your index or outlook have any relativity to how Rhode Island is faring compared to other states, or do you have any other
Yeah.
data that
I
you can?
mean, I've used over the years data, for example, Federal Reserve Bank of Boston, looking at US, New England, and all 6 states or whatever. And even looking at the last recession, it was alarming. We were the first whose employment peaked. We fell the farthest, we came back the slowest. And really what we need to do, and it hasn't happened, we need to reinvent ourselves, because as a post-manufacturing economy, and that happened, by the way, late 1987, the rules of the game are much less forgiving. You've got to earn growth. You've got to reinvent yourself. But if you think, and I know you deal with this more than I
Explain what
do,
you mean by earn growth.
in other words, you've got to be proactive and you've got to make your economy better, more pro-business. You've got to really do things that are amenable to growth. And
Exactly all the things our General Assembly are not doing, correct?
yeah, well, like it's something new. Yeah, I mean, someday, and probably long after I'm dead, because I've tried since, the Providence Journal op-ed since the 90s, and I've met with a bunch of them, teach them the distinction between consumption investment and investment oriented, because they just lapse toward consumption oriented, like the the auto car phase out tax and
Yep,
stuff.
yep.
We should be devoting that to a better place, especially
That's right.
coming out of this. But if you think about it, we're running the state exactly the same way as we did 40 years ago. But the world changed, we didn't.
And would you say another way to say what you just said, as I've said it, that they are fixated on demand side economics, where you and I probably are more supply side economic thinkers?
I'm not even sure what economics they're focused on. I'll be honest with you. I mean, they're
Yeah,
wonderful
special
people.
interest
Don't get me wrong.
economics, isn't it? Yeah.
I mean, because I've, after I've testified several times on the way home, I'm thinking to myself, my God, what is going on? I don't want to elaborate, but how do I give students in Kingston bad grades? It's just, I mean, I testified on, the 38 Studios bond thing, should we default or not? And the second time I testified, it dawned on me, nobody in the state has even considered present values,
Right.
which are I mean, oh my God, how can you do that? And so it just goes on. So I'm not sure what the economics is here. It's not.
You mean in the General Assembly, right? Yeah.
Yeah, and yeah, I mean, business has a very good idea, but our state government and local governments, whew.
Um, well, you just mentioned bonds. So a two-part question for you, Professor. What kinds of policies do you think, and this is more of a subjective question, what kind of policies will impact your outlook index or your leading index,
Mhm.
and if you saw the opinion piece in the Providence Journal today from our treasurer, Seth Magaziner, he's talking about floating a $600 million bond to help plug the budget hole.
Yeah,
And how would that affect your leading indicator? So a general question and then
yeah.
that specific.
Well, that would take a while, but the whole issue of the bonds is that pretty much every state is in a mess right now because the nature of the way our economy is set up, when you have any kind of slowdown, tax revenue automatically falls, entitlement spending automatically rises. Now, my guess is when we have another round of stimulus that they're talking about, it's going to have some benefits for individual states because one of the problems when a state has to balance a budget in a bad time, it makes it worse. And it also undoes what's happening at the federal level. So the issue of bonds, and I've been saying, and you probably follow this for years, we got to be careful. It's not just like, here's a new credit card, let her rip. I mean,
Well, that's what
we've
the
got to be
treasurer
very
made it
careful.
sound like today in his piece. We got plenty of room to borrow up to $600 million, we think.
Well, ignorance is bliss. I mean, what happens, you start doing that, and then what if your credit rating starts falling? There's a whole bunch of things because we don't have as robust an economy as we really need it to be. And so I think there's an issue about our ability to afford debt. I mean, and the agencies,
Right.
to be honest with you, seem to be kind of lagging as far as
Yeah.
where people are rated.
And you said something I think is very key. If we had a healthy, robust economy, we could afford to take on maybe a
Right.
little bit more debt. But when we're struggling by any national measure, as well as by our own measures, it's not the time to put an extra burden or an extra boot on the neck of families and small businesses. Um,
Yeah.
Staying on the subjective side for a little while longer, and you kind of indicated a little bit earlier, making Rhode Island a more business-friendly place. What would be your personal economic prescriptions that you think would give your leading indicators index the best boost for our state?
Well, it's something that's not sexy, and I've been advocating for decades, but what Rhode Island doesn't have that other states do is in-house due diligence. Because what we end up doing essentially is our due diligence largely consists of the word should. And we've been doing that years ago in an op-ed. I had to make up a bunch of terms, like I made up the first in, first out as philo, and that's due presumption. And the point is the world's not linear. So the impact of one policy depends on other factors, like let's say a non-adequately skilled labor force, things like that. So if we had in-house due diligence and you can afford the people, probably save a lot of money over the consultants, then we would have meaningful in-house due
Would,
diligence impact analysis based on how our economy works.
would due diligence basically be something like a fiscal note or something like that? And
Yeah.
All right, what? Very interesting point, because you may recall years ago when our center first came on the scene, we were advocating. No, not a lot of people agree with this, but I'll tell you about it. Say we advocated for a massive cut, if not elimination, of the sales tax
Hmm.
as a way to boost the economy, and we didn't do that because it should happen. We purchased a very expensive economic modeling tool that said it did exactly what you said. It looked at Rhode Island's unique economic makeup,
Yeah.
the economy of the states around it, all the specific workforce and, revenue streams and percentages for each. And the calculation showed that the sales tax was the most dynamic cut, that raising or lowering that would have the biggest impact on our economy. So that's where that came from. Now, due diligence, let me ask you this, would probably also mean that they should stop getting away from static scoring of bills and go to a more dynamic model, right?
Yeah,
Because
I
like
mean,
what
that's what,
you had,
yeah. I mean, because a lot of times your static impact is just, it's going to have a very different look than what happens when people adjust over the longer term. But I mean, we have to look at things because, and I'll go back to the old example, and I don't really care if we had kept or lost the Pawsox, but 120 legislative days, are you kidding me? We should have used that to make ourselves ready for what was going to be an upcoming recession. And if we had the in-house due diligence, the government would have had a position. Here's where we are, probably within 2 weeks, done. And that's the kind of thing, because we know how our state reacts. We know what we can afford, what we need to do. And it would add a magic word to economic planning in this state. And that word is no.
yeah, we call it crystal ball prognosticating what should happen or what
Yeah,
might happen.
yeah.
It,
And it
it's
never does.
yeah,
They're
not
always
right. It never
surprised.
does. It's no way to run a government. All right, Larry, let's go to our next slide. So I'd like to talk to you, Professor, about the economic index we put out every
Okay.
quarter. We do it
Yeah.
quarterly. It's called our Jobs and Opportunity Index. Basically, we look at three factors. We kind of look at a broader view of the unemployment situation, and we account properly for when the labor force goes down. That's a bad thing, not a good thing. um,
Yeah. Tell me about it.
we look at the amount of people that are the amount of public welfare that's put out versus the amount of people receiving public assistance versus the amount of people working, as a summary of the second factor. And the third factor is a ratio that looks at the amount of private income versus the amount of overall state taxes collected.
Mhm.
What's that ratio there?
Yeah.
So when you put those three factors together, as you can see, Rhode Island is last in New England by far, New Hampshire way ahead of us. And the second chart below shows that, you can see that New England on average in the United States overall are trending almost perfectly, but there's Rhode Island, a huge hunk below New England and below the rest of the country. So
Yeah.
we try to bring relativity to it, how, compared to other states where yours is kind of,
Yeah. It would be too much work for me to do that.
no, I know, but does that make sense to you that,
I mean, relativity is major. It really does matter a great deal. And actually, what I will tell you is that, some years ago when I got that employment data for all, the US, New England, and the 6 states, it kind of looked like that. Rhode Island was well below everyone else. We peaked first, we fell the farthest, and we came back the slowest. I mean, so what you're seeing is a microcosm of that, because obviously employment has a bearing on a lot of those metrics, certainly. So, yeah, I mean, this is something that Rhode Island, as far as economic growth, has done very poorly. We're not very far above where we were in 2015, while other states have done well. And a statistic you probably have heard me talk about, and I still can't believe it, even before the pandemic, there were fewer Rhode Islanders employed than in 2006. I mean,
right?
and that's what
We,
you're picking up.
we never reached our peak employment after the recession. That's
No.
one of the things we measure in here as well. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, that's a big deal. I mean, because you want the Rhode Island to be working and things. So what we had was the employment rate, which looks at what percentage of the population is employed.
Right.
That never got back. I know something your shop works on, the labor force participation rate, never got back. In fact, what I did, I actually calculated something. I had some time in office hours because I'm often like, I don't remember the Maytag repairman. but no one really comes. And so what I did was, if our labor force participation, this prior recovery, had been the same as the average in the earlier recovery, the one before that, what would our unemployment rate have been? So while the state's hiding behind a 3.4, which is totally because our labor force fell for a decade,
Right.
it would have been 7.7.
Right.
And that's another reason why going into this, we weren't ready, because we're doing fun things like debating the Paw Sox for, 4 months.
Well, what you said, we actually do a little bit different analysis of what you just said. We said you said that if the amount of jobs were different, we say if the labor force were what it was before the recession, our unemployment rate would also be probably double what it is right now.
Well, the way that I did it,
Way to
if you had the
look at
same participation rate, you would have had a much bigger labor force.
Right. Right.
So using the employment rate, we would have never been anywhere near what the published rates are, but the state hid behind it.
So what you are both saying is, listen, we had a very fragile economy going in. Like you said, with your leading indicators, I mean, the numbers are inconceivable what you're putting up there.
Yeah.
Regardless of how they relate to any other state. And so let's bring up, let's skip a slide, Larry, and go to number 4. So we talked to Leader Filippi from the House Republicans. The Democrats refused to send someone to talk. And we put out a report earlier this week called "These Upcoming Budget Negotiations: The Decision of the Century." When you've got to fill $1 billion budget gap, and you could go anywhere from increasing taxes to increasing debt to cutting spending, or some combination of all three. But when you're talking $1 billion, Professor, in our economy,
I know.
That's whatever decision you make, that's going to have a massive and long-term impact on this state's economic trajectory, isn't it?
It does. And that's why initial conditions matter, so to speak, because when you have to budget, I think the number I'd heard, and I have no idea if it changed because I just stopped paying attention, like 800 million over the end of this fiscal year and next. I mean, that's huge. And for us to deal with that is almost impossible. That's why I think kind of pray for something like, the federal government to help, or if you remember the old days, the tobacco settlement, which we squandered on balancing a budget.
Always had these little saviors, haven't we? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, that was consumption, not investment. Again, what not to do. So, yeah, this is something that's major. And, years ago, I formulated a report card for spending. Is it consumption oriented, investment oriented? Is it affordable, short term, long term? And if they would grade that, because what you should do is, and it's too depressing for me, is just to look at, where of the spending cuts, are they essentially indifferent between consumption oriented and investment oriented? And that's a big deal. You don't want to be indifferent. You want to favor cutting consumption oriented things. Now, the other thing that worries me, and I'm sure it worries you even more, this is an opportunity to sneak in the way to tax services. And the argument, which is non-existent, well, we're now more of a service-based economy, so we should tax that. And again, for a long time, if you do that, it has to be earmarked. You can't just throw it into the general fund, which is the god of current consumption. That's got to stop. It's got to be earmarked only toward investment-oriented things.
Hey, if they earmark it, they're only gonna scoop it later. So what's it really matter, right? So you bring up a great point. So I made a list here. So pending, this is publicly or in legislation now. There are calls for a new wealth tax. There are calls for a new carbon or gasoline taxes. There are calls to slow down or stop the phase out of the car taxes. There are rumors of cuts to local aid that will surely raise property taxes. They want to reimpose sales taxes on liquor and wine. They want to legalize marijuana just so they can collect taxes on it.
Yeah.
They want to expand sales taxes or fees on multiple new services and items, from hunting and fishing taxes and taxes on deliveries and building and permit fees. I mean, what will that do to your leading indexes?
Well, I mean, eventually, it's obviously going to hurt growth. Not that we started from a great place and we've been really dropped down. So this could take a modest recouping. I won't call it a recovery per se. It's kind of a rebound. It would certainly take a modest one and go sideways to down again. And that's the thing. Again, we can't do worse than shut down, but that doesn't mean things are going to feel good. But the other point you made, which is a good one, is that if you do some cuts at the state level, who says we're not going to then see
Right.
property taxes go up, which have been a problem here for as long as I've lived here. And so, we might end up actually with much higher taxes than what we think. And even, the spending might not be focused on investment oriented. So this is really a crapshoot. I'd love to see a balance, not to have a line item veto, but
Right.
even though that would pass by 90+%, it'll never get on the ballot. Those are the kind of things we need. Someone has to throw, something, a little stick into the spokes there to kind of slow this down.
And I don't know who is an economic thinker up there. I've worked pretty closely. We've kind of given up on it, Professor, in the last year or two, because either they don't understand, either they're willfully ignorant, or they just don't have anyone with the capacity to think the way you suggested. But I don't know who the person up there that's going to shine the light on this properly. I mean, are you aware of anyone who's going to
Well, I mean,
understands the way economics really works?
I heard there is now someone on the payroll with the title economist, probably an undergrad, but at least that's a start, I guess, for Rhode Island. But no, I mean, that's why you need the in-house due diligence. They can evaluate policies and their impact given the specifics of our economy. And more importantly, develop a knowledge base. Because remember, years ago, RIPEC said we need to have a plan. They didn't really understand what it was. They're not very strong on economics, but this would be a way to make a plan and make it dynamic as we update based on the specifics of our knowledge and our needs. So we have no way of critiquing this, so we just use the word should.
All right, last economics question for you, then a fun one. Anyway, of course, as the federal economy goes, and we'll go our state, but we're not totally hitched to that. We, like you said, we can do things to help improve our lot, and we certainly have done things that will worsen our lot, and I hope we don't continue that. But based on your factors, is there any way you can, and I know it's just speculation, I get that, but is there any way you can prognosticate if Rhode Island is in for a V, a U, or an L-shaped recovery?
I'm thinking more like those kind of exotic shapes, like a W or a Nike swoosh or something like that. But I see there's going to be kind of a second round. We're leveling off nationally, and Rhode Island, because of durable goods and retail and housing, is very tied to the national economy. So that's going to bring us down. But we have these internal problems. And ironically, the CARES Act is bringing people into the labor force who normally wouldn't have been there, which is going to make the unemployment rate seem higher than it would or should be. So yeah, this is, I mean, the whole issue, it's very frustrating, to be honest with you. And I've tried, because it's part of my job, service to the state, but I'll be honest with you, a lot of times I feel like I'm running into a brick wall, and then, just stepping back and starting again.
Well, the best way to summarize the point you made earlier be that when you talk about consumption, that the General Assembly seems to be over-focused with the false, or seems to fall prey to the false notion that providing consumers with more buying power and providing workers with more benefits and compensation, minimum wage, all that kind of stuff, is more important than creating an environment that's good for job producers and employers. It seems like the job producers and the employers are always the ignored factor in all this, the bad guy in some people's minds, and that's why our state economy is in such shambles.
I mean, do they even know how to create a favorable job climate? Look at what they did several years ago. They hired Brookings. Brookings did a story, and they did a study. And my guess is if 5 other states commissioned them, you'd have the same hot industries. Then we haven't done anything to do it. So now they're commissioning another one. They don't know what to do. They're totally throwing darts. And that's why step one has to be in-house due diligence. We've got to start putting knowledge and economic reality into this and learning how to say no to certain things.
Yeah, the folly, I think, is that they think that it has to be a government inspired, government funded, or government induced recovery. What I don't think they understand, and I think you might agree with me on this, is that if you just get out of the way, American people, American businesses will do it on their own. Just get the boot off of their neck. You don't need to plant specific seeds in specific industries. It will happen. That's what the magic, the invisible hand of the free market is, isn't it?
You got to do it carefully in things, but again, they're not doing. They're just doing it and just randomly. So where it stops, we'll find out.
All right, last question, since you're wearing that hat. So how good of friends were you with Bobby Knight back in your
Actually, I
postgraduate?
never met him. I learned a lot from him. I really did. He was an excellent teacher. People went to Indiana then to learn basketball, not to play it. He was an amazing coach. And so I was there for a couple of national championships. It was terrific. But it's an amazing school. I really was. And I was able to visit it recently because my son, as it turns out, is on the medical school faculty there. So
Oh,
it was great to go down there and visit Bloomington again.
yeah, well, I played for the in AAA with the Indianapolis
Yeah.
Indians, a name they
Okay.
probably don't use anymore. But
Mhm.
I never was on the Indiana campus. I'd like to do that at some point. But
Yeah. Bloomington's the main campus. That's beautiful.
well, yeah, that is on my wish list. Professor Len Lardaro, thank you for being with us today. Thank you for your wisdom and insight and for your leading indexes. Factor, what's the proper name of it? I know I'm getting it wrong all the time.
Current conditions index.
Current conditions indexes. And we hope, will you join us every month to discuss updates to your index?
Sure, that would be fine.
Good. We'll look forward to that, and I'm sure we'll all listeners. Listen, God bless, stay safe, and again, thank you for your time and wisdom. For another session of In the Dugout, this is Mike Stenhouse. End of the ninth inning. We'll see you next game. Ciao.